Hello everyone, Mr. Harper, and let's continue our discussion on the stem of the plant. This will be our last of 3 lectures on the stem, last ed puzzle. So let's review a tiny bit and remember that in the last session, the last ed puzzle that I did, we were talking about this thing called the vascular cambium. Vascular cambium is this green ring of tissue. It goes all the way around the stem. And on the inside of the vascular cambium, xylem cells are made. And on the outside of the vascular cambium, phloem cells are made. It is this vascular cambium that is responsible for making the vascular tissue, the xylem and the phloem. And I told you that these first 3 little bumps, those are what's called the primary phloem, the first phloem cells made. And these bumps here on the inside, the 3 bumps, those are the primary xylem, the first layer of xylem cells made. And then as the plant continues to grow, more and more layers of xylem are made on the inside. So here's a second layer of xylem cells called the secondary xylem, and a second layer of phloem cells called the secondary phloem that are being made. As those new cells are being made, it makes the stem grow thicker and thicker and thicker. And this is what is called secondary growth, making the stem grow thicker or wider around. So it's the vascular cambium, making xylem and phloem, that's responsible for that. I remind you of that as we continue our discussion, because we want to talk about a new cambium today, and this is called the cork cambium. Just like the vascular cambium, the cork cambium is also a circular layer, and here you see it right here in this ring of tissue. This ring of tissue is called the cork cambium, and it makes 2 things. On its inner surface, it makes what is called cortex. We've talked about that before, responsible for storing food. And on the outer surface, it makes something new. It makes something called bark. So we're going to talk about those a little bit. It'll just be a few minutes. So most of what is made and we call secondary xylem cells, when we look at the tree trunk, we call that wood. Okay? So this center area here, that's called wood, this dark piece in the center and this lighter piece, those are mostly all what is called secondary xylem. And as the stem grows thicker, that oldest piece of the xylem cells in the center, a couple things happen to them. One, it gets dark, they get darker, and we call that heartwood. It's this dark area here in the center. And a couple of things happen to it that make it darker. One, the xylem, remember xylems were like tubes. The tubes become clogged, and water can no longer go through them. They become clogged with these resins and gums, and those resins and gums, as they clog up the xylem, make it look darker. They stain it darker. And so this heartwood, as it's called, are layers of secondary xylem cells that are no longer moving water. And it's dead. This whole area in the center, not alive anymore. Now around the outside, this is called the sapwood. This area is the xylem tubes that are not clogged, and that is still moving water and minerals through it. It's lighter in color. On some plants, the difference between the darkness of the heartwood and the sapwood is not as noticeable. Their heartwood is not nearly as dark, so the 2 are a lot closer in color, but you can still see a difference, and the heartwood in the middle is still plugged up. The tubes are plugged up, the xylem tubes, and not moving anything anymore. Now, let's talk about tree rings, because you see those in a cross-section of a stem when you cut a tree. So here you see these rings. You see like a light ring and then a dark ring, then a light ring, then a dark ring, then a light ring, then a dark ring. What causes that? Well, here's what's going on. In the spring, there's lots of water, the temperature's nice, and the vascular cambium begins to grow really, really quick. And it makes xylem cells, because remember the secondary xylem is what makes the wood. It makes xylem cells that are really big and they look lighter colored. Now, as summertime comes, the water there's not as much water. It gets really hot, maybe not best conditions for growth. So growth of that vascular cambium slows down, and the wood that's produced later on in the summer, the cells are smaller and they're darker. Okay, and then the next spring you have another big growing season, light colored again, and then dark colored. And so what you see is this alternating rings: light, dark, light, dark, spring, summer, spring, summer, spring, summer. And each one of those rings, then, the difference between the two, produces what is normally a year's worth of growth. So usually a ring of the tree corresponds to a year's worth of growth. And so by counting the rings, you can age the tree. So you have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years of growth. Spring, summer, spring, summer kind of things. And you can also tell some conditions about weather conditions, some ideas about weather conditions. The thicker the ring, the more growth occurred that year. So that means, well, this year right here, look at how much growth there was. And this year right here, look how much growth. This year, look how little growth in comparison. So the conditions for growing must have been nice weather that year. Good amount of rain, temperatures were just right, and other years, well, not as good. So you can also see, like here, there was an injury at this point. And you can also see that in the rings. So, last thing to say. You just need, go ahead. In a mature stem, all the tissues found outside of the vascular cambium make up the bark. So remember, the vascular cambium is that layer that makes the xylem and the phloem. Everything outside of the vascular cambium is bark. And you can see that there's the phloem. So here's the look again. Here's the vascular cambium right here. This is all xylem, all in the middle. Primary and secondary xylem. You got heartwood and you've got sapwood. That's all part of the xylem, and we call that wood in the tree. On the outside of the vascular cambium, here's the phloem that was made. And that phloem is transporting the nutrients. And then on the outside of that, you have the cork cambium layer. The cork cambium is making the cortex, which would be here on the inside. They're not showing that cortex. And on the outside of that, it's making what is called cork, which is, as it says here, non-functioning phloem. It's tubes that are plugged and not doing anything on the outside of that. But all of this area from the from the phloem out are all part of what is called the bark of the tree. So there's another way of looking at it. Got heartwood, sapwood, vascular cambium. Vascular cambium is making all of this xylem on the inside and the living phloem on the outside. And then you have the cork cambium that is making outside of that the cork. And that cork is waterproof. It helps to protect the stem of the plant from losing too much water. And as the stem increases and increases in size, that bark, all that dies on the outside, and it can crack and fall off of the tree. Different species of trees have different thicknesses of bark. Some have very, very thick bark, others not as thick. Everything on the outside of that is the bark. So really what we focused on today is the cork cambium. Remember, the cork cambium makes on the inside the cortex, which is the piece of the plant where food is being stored. You notice something in this. The cortex is not really thick the way it is in the root. It's not thick in the stem the way it is in the roots. Because remember, cortex stores food. The stem is not storing food the way the root is. And on the outside of that cork cambium, then you have the phloem and cork. or no, excuse me, on the outside of the cork cambium you don't have phloem, it's on the inside. On the outside of the cork cambium you have the cork being made, which is the bark. Alright, that's it for today. We'll talk more next time.